The year is 1940, and the sound of jackboots echoes through the cobblestone streets of Brussels. Belgium has fallen in just 18 days, crushed under the iron treads of the Wehrmacht's Panzer divisions. The swastika now flies over the Grand Place, and the Belgian people wake up each morning to a new reality. Their country belongs to Hitler. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. While the generals surrendered and the politicians fled, there was one man, a simple mechanic with grease under his fingernails, who decided he wasn't done fighting. His name was Robert Maistriau, and what he did in the shadows of occupied Belgium would cripple dozens of Nazi war machines without firing a single shot. This is the story of how one ordinary man turned sugar and sand into weapons of war, and how the Gestapo hunted him for years without ever knowing his face. Before the invasion, Brussels was a city of art, chocolate, and the hum of industry. Robert Maistriau was 32 years old, a skilled automotive mechanic who ran a small repair shop in the Schaerbeek district. He knew engines the way a surgeon knows the human body, every valve, every piston, every weakness. He had worked on everything from delivery trucks to luxury automobiles, and his reputation for precision made him the go-to man for complicated repairs. When the Germans rolled into Belgium on the 10th of May, 1940, Robert watched from his workshop window as the Panzers moved through the streets like a steel river. The sound of their engines was perfect, synchronized, unstoppable. He had never felt more powerless in his life. The Belgian army collapsed within weeks, and King Leopold III ordered a ceasefire. The country was carved up, placed under military occupation, and every Belgian citizen was now expected to comply, to work, to serve the Third Reich's war machine. For most people, survival meant keeping your head down. For Robert Maistriau, it meant something else entirely. The occupation changed everything overnight. German commandants requisitioned factories, warehouses, and workshops for the war effort. Within months, Robert's repair shop received a visit from Wehrmacht logistics officers. They had a proposal, or rather an order. The German military needed skilled mechanics to maintain and repair their vehicles, including the feared Panzer tanks that had just conquered half of Europe. Robert was given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: work for the Germans or face arrest for refusing to cooperate with the occupation authority. He signed the papers, shook the officer's hand, and reported for duty at a German motor pool on the outskirts of Brussels. To the Nazis, he was just another conquered Belgian, grateful for the work, eager to please. They had no idea they had just hired their own saboteur. The motor pool was a fortress of steel and diesel fumes. Dozens of Panzers lined up in rows, their hatches open, their engines exposed for maintenance. Robert walked among them like a surgeon preparing for an operation, except his goal wasn't to heal, it was to kill. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were technological marvels of their time, equipped with Maybach engines that could push 30 tons of armor across mud, snow, and battlefield debris. But Robert knew something the Germans didn't fully appreciate. These engines were also incredibly sensitive. A single grain of sand in the oil system could score the cylinder walls. A handful of sugar in the fuel tank could caramelize in the combustion chamber and seize the entire engine block. The beauty of it was that the damage would be invisible at first, undetectable during a routine inspection. The tank would roll out of the depot, head toward the front lines, and then, miles away from help, the engine would scream, overheat, and die. No explosions, no evidence, just mechanical failure, plausible deniability. Robert began his campaign of silent destruction in the winter of 1940. He would arrive early before the German supervisors and move through the motor pool with a small canvas bag hidden under his coat. Inside were two weapons: refined white sugar stolen from a black market contact, and fine sand collected from construction sites around Brussels. When no one was watching, he would unscrew the fuel cap of a Panzer, pour in a handful of sugar and replace the cap. Other times, he would drain a small amount of engine oil, mix it with sand, and pour it back into the crankcase. The work had to be fast, invisible, and random enough that the Germans wouldn't see a pattern. He never sabotaged every tank, only 1 or 2 per week, just enough to be devastating, not enough to be obvious. And then he would return to his workbench, put on his dirtiest overalls, and spend the rest of the day performing flawless repairs on other vehicles, maintaining his cover as the Reich's most reliable Belgian mechanic. But Robert Maistriau wasn't working alone, and his sabotage was about to become part of something much bigger. Across occupied Europe, a shadow war was beginning. Men and women who refused to bow to the swastika were forming networks, passing messages, hiding Jews, and yes, destroying Nazi war machines from the inside. Robert had made contact with a resistance cell operating out of Brussels, a group that included students, factory workers, and even a few former Belgian army officers. They called themselves the White Brigade, and they were about to teach Robert that sugar and sand were just the beginning. The Nazis had the guns, the tanks, and the power, but the resistance had something far more dangerous. They had mechanics, chemists, and engineers who knew exactly how to make the Third Reich's technology turn against itself. The hunt for the saboteurs had begun, and the Gestapo was closing in. The German military machine depended on precision, and that precision made it vulnerable. By early 1941, reports were flooding into Wehrmacht headquarters from across Belgium and northern France. Panzer units were experiencing catastrophic engine failures at an alarming rate. Tanks that had passed inspection in Brussels were breaking down 50, sometimes 100 miles away, stranded on rural roads or in the middle of training exercises. German mechanics would tear apart the engines, searching for defects, and find cylinders scored beyond repair, fuel injectors clogged with brown residue, crankshafts frozen solid. The official explanation was poor quality fuel or defective parts from subcontractors, but a few sharp-eyed officers began to suspect something else. These failures weren't random. They were too frequent, too similar, and too convenient. Someone, somewhere in the supply chain, was waging war with a wrench and a bag of household supplies. Robert Maistriau understood that his window of opportunity was closing. The more tanks he sabotaged, the greater the risk of discovery. The Germans had begun implementing new security protocols at the motor pool. Surprise inspections became routine. Civilian workers were watched more closely, their bags searched at the end of every shift. Guard patrols increased around the fuel depots and storage areas. Robert adapted. He stopped carrying sugar and sand in his pockets, and instead began hiding small quantities inside hollowed-out tools, a wrench with a hidden compartment, an oil canister with a false bottom. He varied his methods, sometimes adding metal shavings to gearboxes, other times loosening critical bolts, just enough that they would vibrate free after hours of operation. The goal was always the same: create failures that looked like accidents, that could be blamed on wear and tear or manufacturing defects. Every tank he crippled was one less weapon pointed at Allied soldiers, one less machine grinding through the streets of some distant occupied city. But the sabotage was taking a psychological toll. Robert lived in constant fear of exposure. He knew what happened to resistance fighters when the Gestapo caught them: torture, execution, and reprisals against their families. Brussels was covered in propaganda posters showing the consequences of defiance. Grainy photographs of hanged saboteurs, their bodies left dangling in public squares as warnings. The Nazis had perfected the art of collective punishment. If one person committed an act of resistance, 10 hostages would be shot. If a German soldier was killed, an entire neighborhood could be razed. Robert carried this weight every single day. Every time he poured sugar into a fuel tank, he wasn't just risking his own life, he was gambling with the lives of his neighbors, his friends, and his elderly mother who still lived in the apartment above his old workshop. The mathematics of resistance were brutal and unforgiving. Yet Robert wasn't alone in his war against the machines. The White Brigade resistance cell had grown bolder and more sophisticated. They had recruited chemists who could create homemade explosives from fertilizer and household chemicals. They had railway workers who could derail supply trains by removing a single bolt from a track switch. They had telegraph operators who fed false information into German communication networks. And they had Robert, the mechanic who could kill a Panzer with a teaspoon of sugar. The cell operated in strict secrecy, divided into small groups that never knew each other's full identities. Robert knew his handler only as Gabriel, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who met him in the back rooms of cafes or in the shadows of St. Catherine's Church. Gabriel would pass him intelligence: which tanks were being prepared for shipment to the Eastern Front, which vehicles were destined for North Africa, which ones were staying in Belgium to suppress resistance activity. Robert prioritized his targets accordingly. The tanks heading east to fight the Soviets were marked for destruction. Every engine he seized was one less weapon in the Nazi war against Russia. By the summer of 1941, the Gestapo had launched a full investigation into the sabotage epidemic. They brought in technical experts from Berlin, engineers who specialized in counter-sabotage and industrial security. These men were methodical and ruthless. They interviewed workers, analyzed failure patterns, and began setting traps. Unmarked tanks were fitted with hidden surveillance equipment. Fuel tanks were sealed with special tamper-evident caps. Some vehicles were even equipped with chemical tracers that would reveal if foreign substances had been introduced into the fuel or oil systems. The net was tightening, and Robert Maistriau knew that his luck couldn't hold forever. The question wasn't if he would be caught, but when, and whether he could do enough damage before the hammer finally fell. The turning point came on a cold morning in October 1941, when Robert arrived at the motor pool to find German military police stationed at every entrance. The usual casual atmosphere had been replaced by cold efficiency. Every worker was stopped, their identification papers examined under harsh electric lights, their tool bags dumped onto inspection tables. Robert's heart hammered in his chest as he approached the checkpoint, his canvas bag containing nothing but legitimate tools, the sugar and sand left safely hidden in a drainage pipe 2 blocks away. The guard barely glanced at him, waved him through, and Robert realized with sick certainty that this wasn't a random inspection. The Germans were looking for someone specific. They knew there was a saboteur in their midst. They just didn't know which face belonged to the ghost who was killing their tanks. Robert made a decision in that moment that would define everything that followed. He wouldn't stop. He would be smarter, more careful, but he wouldn't stop. The increased security forced Robert to evolve his tactics yet again. Direct sabotage at the motor pool had become too dangerous, so he shifted his focus to the supply chain itself. Through his contacts in the White Brigade, Robert learned that the Germans were sourcing replacement parts and lubricants from Belgian contractors who had been coerced into serving the occupation. These suppliers were terrified of both the Nazis and the resistance, caught between collaboration and patriotism. Robert and his cell began targeting these suppliers, not with violence but with persuasion and bribery. A factory foreman who produced ball bearings for Panzer transmissions was convinced to introduce microscopic defects into 10% of his output, flaws so small they wouldn't be detected during quality control, but would cause catastrophic failure under combat stress. A lubricant distributor agreed to dilute high-grade engine oil with cheaper substitutes that would break down at high temperatures. The beauty of this approach was its scalability. Robert wasn't sabotaging individual tanks anymore. He was poisoning entire production runs. Dozens, potentially hundreds of vehicles would roll off assembly lines already carrying the seeds of their own destruction. But this expansion came with new risks and moral complexities. The suppliers who cooperated with the resistance were risking everything. If the Germans discovered the sabotage and traced it back to the source, the consequences would be medieval. The Nazis had already executed factory owners for far less, turning their facilities into examples. Robert struggled with the weight of these decisions. He was asking ordinary Belgians, people with families and children, to commit acts that could get them killed. Some refused outright, too frightened to take the risk. Others agreed but demanded money, rare in an occupied economy where currency had lost most of its value. The White Brigade scraped together what they could. Gold coins hidden before the invasion, cash stolen from German supply offices, anything that could compensate these reluctant conspirators for the terror they would live with every day. Robert became not just a saboteur but a recruiter, a coordinator, a man who carried the burden of other people's fear. The results, however, were undeniable. By the winter of 1941, German commanders across Belgium were reporting mechanical failure rates that defied statistical probability. Entire Panzer companies were being pulled from frontline deployment for emergency maintenance. Replacement parts were being shipped from Germany only to fail within weeks of installation. The Wehrmacht's logistics officers were tearing their hair out, trying to understand why their Belgian operations had become a mechanical nightmare. Some began to suspect sabotage on an organized scale, but the evidence was maddeningly elusive. How do you prove that a ball bearing was intentionally manufactured with a microscopic crack? How do you demonstrate that engine oil was systematically diluted when chemical analysis shows only slight variations within acceptable tolerances? The sabotage was hidden in plain sight, disguised as the ordinary friction of industrial production under wartime conditions. Meanwhile, the Gestapo was getting closer. They had arrested 3 members of a resistance cell in Antwerp, and under torture, one of them had mentioned a mechanic in Brussels who specialized in vehicle sabotage. The description was vague. Dozens of mechanics fit the profile, but it was enough to put Robert on a list. Gestapo officers began making rounds to motor pools and repair shops, asking questions, showing photographs of known resistance members, offering rewards for information. Robert heard about the arrests through Gabriel, his handler, who delivered the news in a whispered conversation behind the altar of St. Catherine's Church. The message was clear: lie low, stop all operations, disappear if necessary. But Robert couldn't disappear. His absence would be noticed immediately, raising suspicions. And besides, the work wasn't finished. The Eastern Front was consuming German armor at a staggering rate, and every tank Robert destroyed was one less machine slaughtering Soviet soldiers and civilians. He had to keep going, even if it meant walking straight into the trap that was slowly closing around him. The winter of 1941 brought something unexpected to occupied Belgium: hope. News filtered through underground radio networks that the German advance into the Soviet Union had stalled outside Moscow. The invincible Wehrmacht was freezing in Russian snow, their supply lines stretched impossibly thin, their vehicles breaking down in temperatures that turned steel brittle and oil into sludge. Robert Maistriau listened to these reports in darkened basements, huddled around illegal radios with other members of the White Brigade, and he understood something profound. The sugar and sand, the diluted oil, the defective ball bearings, all of it mattered. Every tank that broke down before reaching the front was one less weapon in Hitler's arsenal. Every hour a German mechanic spent repairing sabotaged equipment was an hour not spent advancing the war machine. The resistance wasn't just symbolic anymore. They were actually degrading the Nazi military capacity, one engine at a time. This realization gave Robert a dangerous sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving the occupation, he was fighting back. But the Gestapo's investigation was now a full-scale manhunt. They had established a special task force dedicated exclusively to industrial sabotage, and they were using methods that went far beyond conventional police work. Gestapo agents began infiltrating resistance networks by posing as sympathizers, offering to help with supplies or transportation, then betraying entire cells to their superiors. They installed hidden microphones in cafes known to be resistance meeting spots. They monitored the families of suspected saboteurs, waiting for a mistake, a careless word, a suspicious absence. Robert's mother was questioned twice by men in long leather coats who asked about her son's activities, his friends, his political views before the war. She told them nothing, but the interrogations terrified her. She begged Robert to stop whatever he was doing, to just keep his head down and survive. He promised her he would be careful, but they both knew he was lying. The resistance had become his identity, his reason for existing in a world that had tried to strip away his dignity. Gabriel, Robert's handler, implemented new security protocols that made their operations even more compartmentalized. Robert no longer received detailed briefings about other resistance activities. He didn't know the names or faces of the chemists producing explosives, the forgers creating false identity papers, or the network helping Allied airmen escape to neutral Spain. All he knew was his specific mission: continue disrupting German vehicle operations through any means possible. Gabriel would leave coded messages in a hollowed-out brick behind a butcher shop in the Marolles district. Robert would retrieve these messages, memorize them, and burn the paper. The instructions were always brief: a specific motor pool location, a type of vehicle, sometimes a date when particular units were scheduled for deployment. Robert would plan his sabotage accordingly, striking when security was lightest, when supervisors were distracted, when the shift change created 30 seconds of opportunity. The psychological pressure was crushing. Robert began having nightmares about being arrested, about watching his mother dragged into a Gestapo interrogation room because of his actions. He lost weight. His hands developed a permanent tremor that he had to consciously suppress when working on engines. Other mechanics at the motor pool noticed his nervousness and made jokes about him being afraid of Allied bombing raids. Robert forced himself to laugh along, to maintain the facade of the anxious but loyal Belgian worker who just wanted the war to end so life could return to normal. Inside, he was screaming. Every morning he woke up wondering if this would be the day the Gestapo kicked down his door. Every evening he returned home wondering if he'd find his apartment ransacked, his possessions scattered, his mother gone. The terror was constant, suffocating, inescapable. Yet despite everything, Robert's sabotage network was growing more sophisticated. The White Brigade had made contact with British intelligence officers operating in Belgium through the MI9 escape line. These officers provided technical specifications for new German equipment arriving from factories in the fatherland. They shared information about Nazi logistics, about which repair depots were understaffed, which supply convoys were vulnerable. In return, Robert and his fellow saboteurs provided the British with detailed reports about German military capabilities, vehicle deployment patterns, maintenance schedules. The intelligence flowed both ways, turning a ragtag group of Belgian resistors into a valuable asset for the Allied war effort. Robert was no longer just a mechanic with a bag of sugar. He had become a soldier in an invisible army, fighting a war that history would barely remember. Spring of 1942 arrived with blooming flowers and fresh terror. The Gestapo had finally made a breakthrough in their investigation. A Belgian collaborator working at a fuel depot had noticed irregularities in inventory records, small amounts of lubricants and additives going missing over several months. Under pressure, he admitted to selling some supplies on the black market, but he also mentioned something else. He had seen mechanics from various motor pools loitering near storage areas at odd hours. The Gestapo cross-referenced these observations with their list of suspected saboteurs and narrowed their focus to 15 men working in German vehicle facilities across Brussels. Robert Maistriau was number 7 on that list. He didn't know this yet, but the invisible noose was tightening around his neck, and time was running out faster than anyone in the White Brigade could have imagined. The resistance cell made the decision to accelerate their operations before the Gestapo could strike. Gabriel informed Robert that they had one final opportunity, a massive one that could justify all the risks they had taken. German intelligence had revealed that a full Panzer battalion, nearly 50 tanks, was being assembled at a staging area outside Brussels for deployment to North Africa. These vehicles were destined for Rommel's Afrika Korps, the elite force that was pushing British troops across the Libyan desert. If Robert and his network could sabotage even a fraction of these tanks before they shipped out, they could significantly impact the North African campaign. The mission required coordination across multiple resistance cells involving mechanics, railway workers, and dock laborers who would handle the final transport. It was the most ambitious operation the White Brigade had ever attempted, and it was also the most dangerous. One mistake, one informant, one careless moment, and dozens of people would die. Robert threw himself into the planning with manic intensity. He spent days studying the staging area's layout, memorizing guard rotations, identifying blind spots in the security perimeter. The Germans had learned from previous sabotage incidents and had implemented layered security, checkpoints, roving patrols, surveillance cameras at key locations, and plainclothes Gestapo agents mixed among the workers. Traditional methods wouldn't work here. Robert couldn't just walk up to a tank and pour sugar in the fuel tank. Instead, he devised a more subtle approach. The resistance would target the fuel tanker trucks that serviced the battalion. These trucks made regular runs from central depots to the staging area, carrying thousands of gallons of diesel. If they could contaminate the fuel at the source before it was ever pumped into the tanks, they could sabotage the entire battalion without ever setting foot in the staging area itself. The plan was elegant, scalable, and terrifying in its implications. The operation required recruiting a fuel depot worker who had access to the storage tanks. The White Brigade identified a candidate, Edouard Delacroix, a 45-year-old widower who worked as a night shift supervisor at the main German fuel depot in the Brussels industrial zone. Eduard had lost his son to a German firing squad the previous year after the boy was caught distributing underground newspapers. His grief had transformed into quiet, burning hatred. When Gabriel approached him with the proposal, Eduard agreed without hesitation. He understood the risks perfectly, understood that he was signing his own death warrant if caught, but he didn't care anymore. His son was dead, his country was enslaved, and he had nothing left to lose except the opportunity for revenge. Robert met with Eduard only once, in a cemetery at midnight, standing between gravestones while rain poured down around them. They discussed technical details, timing, quantities. Eduard would introduce the contaminants into the storage tanks during his overnight shift, when security was lightest and other workers were scarce. The sabotage would be invisible, untraceable, and absolutely devastating. The night of the operation arrived on April 15th, 1942. Eduard entered the fuel depot carrying his lunch pail as usual, nodding to the German guards who barely looked at him anymore. Inside that lunch pail were glass containers filled with a special mixture prepared by the White Brigade's chemists, fine sand, sugar, and a chemical additive that would accelerate engine corrosion. Over the course of 6 hours, working in complete darkness except for a small flashlight, Eduard climbed the maintenance ladders of 3 massive fuel storage tanks and poured the contaminants directly into thousands of gallons of diesel fuel. The mixture dispersed slowly, invisibly, becoming part of the fuel supply that would service not just the Panzer battalion, but dozens of other German vehicles across the region. When Eduard climbed down the final ladder, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the railings. He had just committed an act of sabotage so massive that its effects would ripple across the entire German military operation in Belgium. He walked out of the depot at dawn, nodded to the morning shift guards, and disappeared into the streets of Brussels. 3 days later, the first tanks began to fail. The catastrophe unfolded exactly as Robert had calculated, but even he was unprepared for the scale of the destruction. Within 72 hours of the contaminated fuel entering the supply chain, German motor pools across Brussels reported a cascade of engine failures that defied explanation. Panzers that had been running perfectly suddenly seized up during routine operations, their engines making horrific grinding sounds before dying completely. Transport trucks broke down on major highways, blocking supply convoys. Even staff cars carrying German officers stuttered and failed in the middle of the city. Wehrmacht mechanics tore apart engine after engine, finding cylinder walls scored beyond repair, fuel injectors clogged with crystallized residue, oil systems contaminated with abrasive particles. The damage was so widespread and so uniform that it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or poor maintenance. This was sabotage on an industrial scale, and someone had struck at the heart of the German military infrastructure in Belgium. The Gestapo's response was swift and merciless. Within days of the fuel depot sabotage being confirmed, they launched a wave of arrests that swept through Brussels like a plague. They rounded up mechanics, fuel depot workers, railway employees, anyone who had access to German military vehicles or supplies. Interrogation centers filled with screaming voices as suspects were tortured for information about resistance networks. The Nazis implemented collective punishment protocols, executing 5 hostages for every German vehicle destroyed. Bodies appeared hanging from lampposts throughout the city, identification papers pinned to their chests, warnings written in both German and French. This is the fate of saboteurs. The terror was designed to break the spirit of the resistance, to make the cost of defiance so high that even the bravest would surrender. For many Belgians, it worked. Informants came forward desperate to save themselves or their families, providing names and addresses to Gestapo interrogators. The resistance network that had taken years to build began to collapse in a matter of weeks. Robert knew his time was up. Gabriel made contact one final time, meeting him in an abandoned warehouse near the Canal District. The handler's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. He told Robert that the Gestapo had arrested Edouard Delacroix and that under torture, Edouard had given up several names, though not Robert's, at least not yet. But it was only a matter of time. The Gestapo was working methodically through the list of motor pool mechanics, cross-referencing employment records, interrogating supervisors, building a profile of the saboteur they were hunting. Gabriel's instructions were clear and final. Robert had to disappear immediately. The White Brigade would provide false identity papers and arrange transport to the countryside, where he could hide with sympathetic farmers until the heat died down. Robert listened to all of this and then said something that surprised even himself. He refused to run. He had one more mission to complete, one final act of sabotage that would justify everything they had sacrificed. Gabriel tried to argue, but Robert was immovable. The Panzer battalion destined for North Africa had been delayed by the fuel contamination, but not cancelled. The Germans were bringing in emergency fuel supplies from depots in northern France, clean fuel that would allow the tanks to be serviced and shipped out within 2 weeks. If Robert could sabotage those vehicles one final time, directly and personally, he could ensure they never reached Rommel's forces in the desert. It was a suicide mission, Gabriel said. The staging area was now on maximum security alert, with Gestapo agents everywhere. Triple the normal guard presence and random inspections of every worker entering the facility. Robert would be caught within hours, maybe minutes. But Robert had made his peace with that possibility. He had been living on borrowed time since the day he poured his first handful of sugar into a Panzer's fuel tank. If he was going to die, he would die doing the work that mattered, crippling the Nazi war machine one last time. The plan was insane in its simplicity. Robert would use his legitimate work credentials to enter the staging area during a scheduled maintenance shift. He would carry nothing suspicious, no sugar, no sand, no tools that couldn't be explained. Instead, he would rely on something far more dangerous: his intimate knowledge of Panzer engineering and his willingness to sabotage vehicles using nothing but the tools and materials already present in the maintenance bay. He would loosen critical bolts in the suspension systems, maladjust fuel mixture settings so engines would run rich and overheat under stress, drill microscopic holes in hydraulic lines that would cause slow pressure loss over days of operation. The sabotage would be invisible during inspection, but catastrophic under battlefield conditions. It was the work of a master mechanic who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of mechanical murder. And it would be his final performance. Robert Maistriau walked through the gates of the staging area on the morning of May 3, 1942, carrying nothing but his toolbox and a thermos of cold coffee. The guards scrutinized his papers with unusual intensity, comparing his face to a photograph, checking his name against a typed list. For a terrible moment, Robert thought they had him, that his name had finally appeared on the Gestapo's arrest warrant, but the guard waved him through with a grunt, and Robert realized they were simply being thorough with everyone. The staging area had transformed into a fortress. Concrete barriers channeled workers through narrow checkpoints. Machine gun nests overlooked the tank formations. Gestapo officers in civilian clothes wandered among the mechanics, watching, listening, waiting for someone to make a mistake. Robert forced himself to breathe normally, to walk with the tired shuffle of a man reporting for another day of tedious labor. Inside, his heart was hammering so hard, he was certain everyone could hear it. The Panzer battalion stretched across the staging area in precise rows, nearly 40 tanks that had survived the fuel contamination or had been refitted with clean engines. They gleamed in the morning sun, deadly and magnificent, each one a masterpiece of German engineering. Robert was assigned to a maintenance crew working on final pre-deployment inspections, checking track tension, testing radio equipment, verifying ammunition storage. It was routine work that gave him access to every critical system on these machines. He worked alongside 3 other Belgian mechanics and 2 German supervisors who never let the Belgians out of their sight. This was the new reality of occupied collaboration. Constant surveillance, perpetual suspicion, the assumption that every conquered person was a potential enemy. Robert played his role perfectly, making small talk about the weather, complaining about food rations, carefully cultivating the image of a man who had accepted his fate and just wanted to survive until the war ended. The opportunity came during the afternoon break, when the German supervisors left to smoke cigarettes and review paperwork in a nearby office. Robert and the other mechanics were supposed to rest, but Robert volunteered to continue working, claiming he wanted to finish his assigned tank ahead of schedule. The gesture earned approving nods from the Germans, who saw it as proper work ethic. The moment they disappeared into the office, Robert moved with practiced speed. He crawled beneath the Panzer, located the main hydraulic line that controlled the turret rotation mechanism, and used a precision drill bit to create a hole so small it was barely visible to the naked eye. The hydraulic fluid would leak slowly over days, and by the time the tank reached North Africa and engaged in combat, the turret would lock up at the worst possible moment. He moved to the next tank, loosened 3 critical bolts in the track assembly, just enough that vibration would work them free after extended travel. The third tank received adjusted fuel injector settings that would cause the engine to run dangerously lean under high load. Robert worked like a surgeon, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, every movement precise and deliberate. He was working on the 4th tank when he heard the shout. One of the German supervisors had returned early and was striding across the staging area, yelling Robert's name. Robert's blood turned to ice. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and expecting for 2 years. He emerged from beneath the tank, wiping grease from his hands, forcing his face into an expression of confused innocence. The supervisor demanded to know why Robert was working alone without authorization. Before Robert could answer, the second supervisor appeared, and between them stood a man Robert had never seen before. Tall, thin, wearing a leather coat despite the warm weather. Gestapo. The man's eyes were cold and analytical, studying Robert the way a scientist studies an insect pinned to a board. He asked Robert his name, his address, how long he had been working for the German military. Robert answered each question calmly, his voice steady, even as his mind raced through escape scenarios that all ended with bullets in his back. The Gestapo officer walked a slow circle around Robert, hands clasped behind his back. He asked about the fuel depot sabotage, whether Robert knew Edouard Delacroix, whether he had noticed any suspicious activity among the other mechanics. Robert denied everything with the perfect mix of confusion and eagerness to help that he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. The officer stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and Robert could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. The officer suspected something but didn't have proof. Not yet. Finally, he ordered the supervisors to keep Robert under constant observation for the remainder of the shift and walked away. Robert returned to work, knowing he had just used up his last bit of luck. He had sabotaged 4 tanks out of 40. It wasn't enough, but it would have to be. The next time the Gestapo came for him, they wouldn't be asking questions. They would be bringing handcuffs and a firing squad. Robert never made it home that night. As he walked through the staging area gates at the end of his shift, 2 men in plain clothes stepped out of a black sedan and called his name. They weren't asking. They were telling. Robert's legs nearly gave out beneath him, but he forced himself to keep walking toward them, maintaining the facade of innocence until the very end. They identified themselves as Gestapo investigators and informed him that he was being detained for questioning regarding the recent sabotage incidents. The words were polite, almost bureaucratic, but Robert understood exactly what they meant. He was under arrest, and everything he had feared for 2 years was about to come crashing down. They didn't handcuff him in public, maintaining the illusion that this was a voluntary interview, but their hands never left his arms as they guided him into the back seat of the sedan. The car pulled away from the staging area, and Robert watched Brussels slide past the window, wondering if he would ever see his city again. The interrogation center was a converted office building in the European quarter, its elegant Art Nouveau facade hiding the screams that echoed through its basement. Robert was taken to a small room with white walls, a single table, and 2 chairs. The Gestapo officer who had questioned him at the staging area sat across from him, no longer playing the role of polite investigator. His name was Hauptsturmführer Klaus Reinhardt, and he had been hunting saboteurs across occupied Europe for 3 years. Reinhardt laid out photographs on the table between them, images of destroyed tank engines, lists of mechanical failures, surveillance reports from motor pools across Brussels. He explained in perfect French that they had been watching Robert for 6 weeks, documenting his movements, tracking his contacts. They knew he was involved in the resistance. They knew he had sabotaged German vehicles. What they wanted now were names, locations, details about the White Brigade's network. Reinhardt promised that cooperation would mean a quick death instead of weeks of torture. Resistance would mean suffering beyond imagination, not just for Robert, but for his mother, his neighbors, anyone the Gestapo decided was complicit in his crimes. Robert said nothing. He sat in that chair and met Reinhardt's gaze with silence that was more defiant than any words could have been. The interrogation continued for hours, questions repeated, threats escalated, but Robert gave them nothing. Not a name, not a location, not a single detail that could compromise the network. Reinhardt's patience eventually snapped. He nodded to the two guards standing by the door, and they dragged Robert down 3 flights of stairs into the basement where the real work happened. The torture began with beatings, methodical and precise, designed to cause maximum pain without killing. When that failed to break him, they moved to more sophisticated techniques, electric shocks, water torture, stress positions that turned muscles into screaming agony. Robert lost track of time down there in the darkness. Hours blended into days. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body a mass of broken tissue and shattered bones, but some core part of him remained intact. He thought about the tanks he had sabotaged, the engines he had destroyed, the small victories that had added up to something meaningful. He thought about Edouard Delacroix and the other resistors who had sacrificed everything. And he thought about his mother, praying she would never know the details of how her son had died. But Robert Maistriau didn't die in that basement, and that's the part of the story that even the Gestapo couldn't explain. On the 5th day of his torture, something unexpected happened. A German army colonel arrived at the interrogation center with orders from Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin. The colonel was furious about the ongoing sabotage crisis and the failure to prevent it. But he was more furious about something else, the torture of skilled mechanics. The German military was facing catastrophic equipment shortages across every front. They needed every trained mechanic they could find, even Belgian ones, even suspected saboteurs. The colonel reviewed Robert's file and saw a master craftsman with years of experience maintaining complex machinery. Killing such a man was wasteful. The colonel overruled the Gestapo and ordered Robert transferred to a Wehrmacht labor battalion being assembled for deployment to the Eastern Front. It wasn't mercy, it was pragmatism. Robert would work for the German army in Russia, repairing their vehicles under armed guard, until he died from exhaustion, disease, or a Soviet bullet. It was a slower death sentence, but it was still a death sentence. Robert was loaded onto a transport train 3 days later, barely conscious, his body wrapped in bandages chained to 30 other prisoners being shipped east. As the train pulled out of Brussels station and headed toward Germany, Robert pressed his face against the cold window and watched his city disappear into the distance. He had failed. He hadn't destroyed enough tanks, hadn't saved enough lives, hadn't struck a blow significant enough to justify all the suffering. The resistance would continue without him, but he would never know if their work mattered, if the sugar and sand and sabotage had actually changed anything. The train rattled through the Belgian countryside, carrying Robert Maistriau toward the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, and he closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness that had been chasing him since that first day he decided to fight back against the machines of war. The Labour Battalion arrived at the Eastern Front in late June 1942, just as Operation Blue, Hitler's summer offensive into southern Russia, was gaining momentum. Robert and the other prisoners were assigned to a field maintenance depot near Voronezh, where German armored divisions were being serviced and repaired before pushing deeper into Soviet territory. The conditions were beyond brutal. They worked 16-hour shifts in temperatures that swung from scorching heat to freezing cold within hours. Food was scarce, medical care non-existent, and guards shot anyone who collapsed from exhaustion as an example to the others. Robert's body was still healing from the torture, his ribs broken, his hands damaged, but the Germans didn't care. He was given a wrench and ordered to work. The irony wasn't lost on him. After spending 2 years destroying German tanks in secret, he was now being forced to repair them in plain sight, keeping the very war machine running that he had dedicated his life to sabotaging. But something unexpected happened in that desolate field depot surrounded by the vastness of the Russian steppe. Robert discovered he wasn't alone. Among the Labour Battalion were other mechanics, other resistors from across occupied Europe, a Frenchman who had sabotaged Luftwaffe aircraft in Paris, a Polish engineer who had destroyed railway bridges, a Czech machinist who had contaminated ammunition in a Prague factory. They recognized each other not through words, but through small gestures, the way they handled tools, the calculated pauses in their work, the brief moments of satisfaction when a repair took slightly longer than it should have. These men had all waged the same invisible war, and now they found themselves imprisoned together in the one place where their skills made them temporarily valuable. They communicated in whispers during meal breaks, sharing stories of sabotage, comparing techniques, finding grim humor in the fact that they were now the very mechanics keeping Hitler's war machine operational. But they also shared something else: a plan. The sabotage at the Eastern Front depot began slowly and carefully. Robert and his fellow prisoners understood that they were under constant surveillance, and that any overt act of resistance would result in immediate execution. But they also understood something the Germans had overlooked. A skilled mechanic can sabotage equipment just as effectively through incompetence as through malice. They began making small, plausible mistakes: bolts tightened slightly too loose, gaskets installed with imperceptible gaps, replacement parts selected from batches they knew were substandard. Every repair was completed just well enough to pass inspection, but inadequate enough to fail under combat stress. The German supervisors saw exhausted prisoners making the kinds of errors that came from overwork and malnutrition, never suspecting these were calculated acts of continuing resistance. Tanks rolled out of the depot and broke down 50 kilometers away. Trucks developed mysterious electrical problems during supply runs. Artillery tractors threw tracks in the middle of operations. The sabotage was invisible, untraceable, and absolutely devastating to German logistics in the southern sector. The work continued through the summer and into the autumn of 1942, as the German offensive stalled and then reversed. The Battle of Stalingrad was consuming German resources at an apocalyptic rate, and the maintenance depot became a critical node in the desperate attempt to keep armored units operational. Robert worked until his hands bled, repairing the same vehicles over and over as they returned from the front damaged and broken. He saw the faces of German soldiers returning from Stalingrad, their eyes hollow with trauma, and he understood that the tide of the war was turning. The invincible Wehrmacht was dying in the Russian winter, ground down by Soviet resistance and the very mechanical failures that Robert and countless other saboteurs had built into their equipment. Every tank that broke down, every truck that failed, every piece of equipment that malfunctioned at a critical moment, these small acts of defiance had accumulated into something larger. The German war machine was collapsing not just from enemy fire, but from internal rot, from the 1,000 invisible wounds inflicted by the people it had tried to enslave. In November 1942, the Soviet winter offensive encircled Stalingrad, and the German Sixth Army was trapped. The maintenance depot received orders to evacuate westward before Soviet forces overran their position. The Labour Battalion was loaded onto trucks for transport, but the convoy never made it. Soviet aircraft strafed the column, destroying half the vehicles and scattering survivors across the frozen landscape. In the chaos, Robert and 4 other prisoners managed to escape into the winter darkness. They walked west for 3 weeks, stealing food, hiding in abandoned buildings, moving only at night. 2 of the men died from exposure and starvation. Robert and the 2 survivors finally reached German-occupied Ukraine, where they were recaptured and sent to a prisoner of war camp, but by then it didn't matter. Robert had survived the Eastern Front, and more importantly, he had continued his war against the machines even in the depths of hell. Robert Maistriau survived the war, though barely. He spent the remaining years of the conflict moving between prisoner of war camps and labor battalions, always working on German vehicles, always finding ways to sabotage them subtly enough to avoid execution. When Soviet forces liberated his final camp in January 1945, Robert weighed less than 90 pounds and could barely walk. He made his way back to Brussels through a continent in ruins, traveling on foot, by rail, on the back of Allied supply trucks. When he finally reached his old neighborhood in April 1945, he discovered that his mother had died 2 years earlier, never knowing whether her son had survived. His repair shop had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid. The street where he had grown up was a wasteland of rubble and burned-out buildings. Everything he had known before the war was gone, erased as if it had never existed. The true scale of what Robert and the resistance had accomplished remained hidden for decades. The sabotage campaign in Belgium and across occupied Europe had been so effective, so widespread, that it became part of the statistical noise of war. German after-action reports attributed mechanical failures to poor manufacturing, supply shortages, and the stress of extended campaigns. They never fully acknowledged that thousands of their vehicles had been systematically destroyed from within by the very people they had enslaved. Modern historians estimate that resistance sabotage reduced German military effectiveness by 15 to 20% across occupied territories, a staggering figure that translated into thousands of vehicles destroyed, tens of thousands of man-hours wasted on repairs, and countless Allied lives saved because Nazi equipment failed at critical moments. Robert's sugar and sand, multiplied across hundreds of saboteurs and thousands of acts, had genuinely impacted the outcome of World War II. Robert himself never sought recognition. He rebuilt his life quietly in post-war Brussels, opening a small motorcycle repair shop and refusing to talk about his wartime experiences. He married, had children, and lived an ordinary life that gave no hint of the extraordinary courage he had shown during the occupation. It wasn't until the 1980s, when historians began seriously studying resistance movements, that Robert's story emerged. By then, he was an old man, and when journalists asked him about the sabotage, he simply shrugged and said he had done what needed to be done. He never used words like hero or brave. To him, resistance had been a simple moral equation. The Nazis had destroyed his country, and he had possessed the skills to fight back, so he fought. There was nothing complicated about it. The story of Robert Maistriau and mechanics like him represents something profound about World War II that rarely makes it into the history books. The war wasn't just won by armies and generals. It was won by ordinary people who refused to submit, who found small ways to resist, who understood that every act of defiance, no matter how small, contributed to the larger struggle. A handful of sugar in a fuel tank seems insignificant compared to the massive battles of Stalingrad and Normandy, but multiply that handful by thousands of acts across millions of occupied citizens, and you get a force that genuinely degraded the Nazi war machine. The resistance wasn't romantic or glamorous. It was terrifying, brutal, and often fatal. But it mattered. Every seized engine, every broken transmission, every vehicle that failed to reach the front line represented lives saved and Nazi ambitions thwarted. Robert Maistriau died in 2008 at the age of 99, one of the last surviving members of the Belgian resistance. His obituary in Le Soir newspaper ran just 3 paragraphs, mentioning briefly that he had been active in the resistance during the war. Most readers probably skimmed past it, unaware that the old mechanic being buried that week had once crippled dozens of panzers with nothing more than household supplies and courage. His story, like so many resistance stories, nearly vanished into the silence of history, forgotten by a world that prefers to remember wars through the lens of grand battles and famous generals. But the truth is simpler and more powerful. Wars are fought by people like Robert Maistriau, ordinary citizens who become extraordinary not through superhuman abilities, but through the simple refusal to surrender their dignity. They are the mechanics and fuel depot workers and railwaymen who understood that resistance doesn't require an army, just a wrench, a bag of sugar, and the absolute conviction that tyranny must be opposed, no matter the cost. That's the story they don't teach in schools. That's the history that almost disappeared. And that's why Robert Maistriau's name deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, but as a testament to what one person with skill and courage can accomplish against impossible odds.